Welcome one and all, it's Christmas Eve and we're about to enter into the true heart of the festive spirit and the Christmas season, but not before the last of the TooFatLardies Advent windows for 2023. And behind this, the final window, is the question that Richard and Nick have set me. What's inspiring me for 2024 and what project do I intend to deliver on? Where's that project now? And what is it about the project that inspires me? And what do I want to achieve with the project? So there's lots of questions there relating to a project which is only just forming in my mind. Anyway, about that later. One of the things that we've talked a lot about on the TooFatLardies podcast over the past 5 years is inspiration. I've talked a lot about inspiration being gradual, an evolving theme over weeks or months, a long gestation period, infused by media, art, films and all the rest of it. But sometimes inspiration comes in a flash from absolutely nowhere, and that was really the genesis for my project for 2024. There's a story in Hollywood. It's from the biography of Don Simpson, one of the great producers of the 1980s. Mr. Simpson was being pitched a movie, and it was an evolution of the film Jaws mixed with people's love for dogs. And the pitch was that the film was going to be Jaws with paws. And I've always thought that that was a brilliant pitch. It synthesised everything down into just one pithy saying. A few weeks back I was at Lard Island playing with Rich and Nick at Richard's game of the English Civil War in the buff, and the moment of inspiration came to me to do something with that game. So in the buff is Richard's game of small scale skirmishes set in the English Civil Wars of around about, I'd say, 30 to 40 figures a side, about half a dozen units, and essentially the focus is on local history and small skirmishes. And Civil Wars are perfect in some respects for miniature wargaming, although obviously they're a fairly grim experience for anyone caught up in it. Civil Wars give lots of unique opportunities on the tabletop. The conflicts take place between combatants who normally share a common language. There's a lot of opportunity for soldiers on either side to swap between the different protagonists, and there's also the possibilities of an abundance of espionage and intrigue, particularly again when everyone in the location shares the same language and heritage. Spies are rife. There's also a lot of intensity of the fighting as brother fights brother and families are pitched against each other, so it's a good starting point for any miniature wargame. I like the fact that the scale of the game was fairly manageable. There weren't too many figures to paint, and the area of the table which Richards was using was about 3 feet square. So compact, manageable, an isolated moment of military history. But there was a good deal of depth there. One of the things I've been thinking about for some time is that as I come towards the end of finishing writing Flashing Blades and When the Last Sword's Drawn, is where to go next as regards some of the figures I've been building up. And I've been quite intrigued by the Japanese Civil Wars, but not the ones that many people will have heard about, which is the 16th century Sengoku era. There were several civil wars over the course of Japan's history, and one of the ones I'm interested in is from the 14th century, called the Nambokucho Civil Wars. So these themes kind of were coalescing in my own head. The opportunity for a game which was larger than what I was playing at the moment, the possibility of a new game featuring a different period of Japanese history and Civil War, and also the need to try and put it all together in a fairly pithy way of describing what might otherwise be a slightly obscure period from Japanese history. So all of these ideas came together, which perhaps as a project name might regard that as being Big in Japan. Yes, not Big Bonsai Bonkers, but Big in Japan. So it would be taking some of the forces from what I've already been creating and the terrain for skirmish gaming and putting it together in a more in-the-buff sized package. A bigger package than I've got at the moment, but still fairly manageable and fairly small. So the Nambokucho Wars were a really interesting period of government breakdown and as often happens in those situations, there's a period for powerful nobles to seek to augment and legitimize their power at the same time. Interestingly, the two main court factions break down as being a northern court and a southern court, so that's quite easy, despite the Japanese names of the protagonists, to get our hands around. But what also drew me to the period is that while large armies were assembled, the Nambokucho Wars were notable for a large number of fairly well documented skirmishes, and there's some quite interesting and accessible contemporary literature which helps describe the way of warfare in 14th century Japan. There's also one outstanding book by Professor Carl Friday in which the form of warfare and the nature of warfare is explained. There's also another book by Thomas Conlon that I don't have at the moment, but I'm rather hoping that might arrive under the tree during the Christmas period. So my idea is to really use the mechanisms, the rule engine and the themes from In the Buff as a chassis, if you like, to create a set of rules in a comparable scale and size of game, but just set the other side of the world and in a different century. During the course of 2024, therefore, we can really have an interesting set of projects which look at wargaming civil wars. We would have the English Civil War on the one hand and the Nambokucho Wars in Japan on the other side, and from the Japanese perspective, looking at the different societal impact, military traditions, customs and tactics of civil war in Japan would be a really interesting counterpoint to the much more familiar style of civil war which many of us are familiar with from the English Civil War or even the American Civil War. Well, that's the idea at its heart. I think it shouldn't be too difficult to create two small armies in 28mm scale fairly easily. I think it's kind of practicable when you're thinking about a project to imagine painting through between 36 and 50 figures a side, and most of the terrain I've probably got for when the last sword is drawn in any event. As for rules, well, Richard, Nick and everyone at Lard Island can be working on the mechanisms and play testing and game balance, so I won't need to reinvent that so much. My part of the project would be bringing to it the elements of warfare from 14th century Japan which would fit within the engine which has been designed for the English Civil War. That allows me the easier work of trying to think about what I need to change in order to move from, say, defying the king at the walls of Kingston upon Hull to infiltrating samurai armies into Kyoto. There's probably more difficulty there which is waiting in the project that I'm imagining at the moment, but that's part of the fun of a project. It's discovering where it takes you as opposed to just dealing with the points that you can identify at the start. As for figures, well, I've got a head start with leftover Dixon miniatures, samurais and retainers from the 14th century, and there's a few figures available from other manufacturers like the Assault Group and Kingsford Miniatures in Canada. One of the things I also want to try and explore is painting the northern and southern court opposing factions in a slightly more thematic manner than I've done in the past, trying to colour coordinate their armour and clothing in a compatible spectrum for each side. I've not tried that before, and I think one of the things it's nice to do in any project is try and think of how it might stretch ourselves, that before we're starting, what can we do new to really make sure that it's a memorable project. I've been picking up ideas throughout the course of the year from various painting podcasts which have been exploring colour theory and colour theming. I'm really quite keen to try that in the context of a small force on either side. So we've got the books, figures, terrain. Richard and Nick can produce the rules, hopefully. I can pinch bits and pieces from them. And we can, in 2024, look forward, I hope, to a project which, while it's not Jaws with paws, it will, hopefully, by this time next year, be big in Japan.